How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so today I want to try to say something about an amazing novel by the German writer Hermann Hesse, which was published in 1930, and it's called Narcissus and Goldmund. So it's a novel that explores the contrasting lives of two of its central characters, namely Narcissus and Goldmund. Narcissus is a scholarly monk who lives and teaches at a monastery, and he will one day become an abbot. He pursues a life of strict rationality and religious devotion. Goldmund, on the other hand, is an artist and a wanderer who immerses himself in the sensual world and who eventually becomes a sculptor. The story explores the tension between these two modes of life, namely the contemplative, disciplined life of the mind versus the sensuous, wandering life of the artist. Okay, so before I get to that, I think a very brief summary might be helpful just to give us some context and some orientation. So the story begins in a medieval monastery school. And it's there that the contemplative and self-disciplined young monk, Narcissus, becomes a counselor and a close friend of Goldmund, a sensitive student who's been sent there by his father. But Narcissus quickly realizes that Goldmund is not meant for the religious, intellectual life, and he helps him to see this. This awakening leads Goldmund to leave the monastery and to basically wander around the world. On his travels, he experiences pretty much everything, and his encounters with women are pretty formative. Eventually, he finds his artistic calling when he apprentices with a master sculptor. But then, in a separate incident, he ends up killing someone in self-defense, and he's imprisoned, and he faces execution. But he's rescued by Narcissus, who's now become the abbot of his monastery. Goldmund returns to the monastery to recover, and the two of them, they contemplate the different paths their lives have taken. In their final conversations, Narcissus recognizes the splendor of Goldmund's artistic life, while Goldmund acknowledges Narcissus's spiritual strength and his groundedness. Goldmund dies in the monastery, and we're left to understand that each of them lived out a path the other could never follow, and that their friendship was really characterized by two fundamentally different and incompatible ways of being in the world. Okay, now that said, I want to try to talk about what it is that Hesse is ultimately suggesting here. So it's pretty obvious that the novel is not just presenting a simple contrast between two different characters. That would be pretty banal. No, I think that what Hesse is suggesting to us is that even though we all have a longing for psychic wholeness, this is not ultimately possible. Or to put this slightly differently, what he's saying is that to live fully is always to live partially or incompletely. That choosing one path in life means letting go of another. This is why our universal desire for completeness or wholeness is ultimately unattainable. But let's get into the details here. So what Hesse is saying is that Narcissus' intellectual purity and Goldmund's artistic sensualism, they demand fundamentally different orientations towards life. That each of these paths asks for sacrifices that makes the other path unattainable. So let's look at Narcissus first. So broadly speaking, he represents the life of the mind. And what does that entail? Well, it entails withdrawal from the world, from the sensual world in particular, like you get when you live in a cloister. And this withdrawal, it makes sense. It makes sense because clarity and order is only made possible by freedom from the perturbations of life. Narcissus needs a stable environment. He needs to put himself in a place that makes him invulnerable from the vicissitudes of the world. He needs a stillness of consciousness if he's going to devote himself to contemplation. He needs to partly renounce the world if he wants to understand it. He can't make himself susceptible to open-ended or uncertain flux that characterizes Goldmund's life. In other words, the life of the mind means that you don't allow yourself to be penetrated by experience. No, you have to be closed and self-sufficient, which means that you can't open yourself up to risk and change and passion. Well, okay, so Goldmund's orientation and way of being in the world, that's completely different. As an artist, as someone who broadly speaking represents the life of the body, Goldmund needs to ensure permeability. In other words, he needs to put himself in environments where he's made vulnerable to experience, to being moved by life. He wants to be transformed by the world around him, even if that means pain or grief or loss. Whether it's the impact of the beauty of a face or the smell of moss or the enigmatic sounds of the night, he needs to give in to them. He needs to surrender to his probing hand and heart. Now, this sort of openness, it's basically incompatible with inner stability. This immersion into experience, it's not going to yield any kind of contemplative stillness. If Goldmund restrained himself like Narcissus does, he would suffocate the very impulses that give his life and his art the spirit that they have, the very stuff that feeds his corporeal soul. Actually, all this reminds me a bit of the psychologist Carl Jung. So he talked about something he called individuation, which for him meant the attempt at integrating opposites in oneself. Now, even though he seems to have stipulated that this is the ultimate goal, as with Hesse, though, I don't think he thought it was possible to completely embody or unify everything that is contradictory in oneself. That's to say, if we orient our being around one particular aspect of ourselves, then their opposite will be reduced to what he called our shadow part. For him, the point is that it's very difficult for contradictory aspects of ourselves to both rule. Anyway, so back to Hesse. So I think that part of his message in the novel is that human life inevitably involves making choices that by virtue of doing so close off different forms of being. That if we want to create and love and don't fear loss, then we can't at the same time cultivate a steadfastly intellectual and contemplative life. Or that if we want to maintain a stable and ordered soul, then of course we can't plunge into the world with abandon. No, choosing one excludes the full manifestation of the other. That's life. That's the existential heart of the human condition. We are never truly free if freedom means that there is no conflict between our commitments. So maybe the answer then, as hard as it is to stop longing for total wholeness and to accept that wholeness is something that lies outside of the horizon of actual human life. And instead, maybe the answer is to embrace a certain temperament or a vision or a mode of being that by definition excludes, but at the same time guides us and gives us purpose. Instead of trying to fully reconcile the demands of the mind and the body or the demands of contemplation and lived experience, pick one and run with it. Make it everything. And yes, what you pick will have its tragic side, but it will also have a luminosity that would never have been possible without that commitment, without that fidelity to a path that you can truly make your own. Bye for now.